Hello, and welcome to week 9 of high school mythology. So, as I mentioned during our last lecture, we are going to do some comparing and contrasting between the royal house of Thebes and the house of Atreus. We're also going to be talking about the royal house of Athens today, too. So we're go ahead and we'll pull up our slides here and talk about this difference, the differences and the similarities between these two families. So as we mentioned last week, the house of Atreus is named after a person, Atreus, whereas the house of Thebes is named after a city. Tantalus and Niobe are the ones who kind of begin this house of Atreus and the curses that follow it. So we'll start now talking about Cadmus and his children from the royal house of Thebes. So unlike the house of Atreus, as we mentioned, this house is named after a city. So the head of this family is Cadmus. Cadmus happens to be a brother of Europa. If you'll recall, Europa was the one who was kidnapped by Zeus whenever he turned himself into a bull. So after she's kidnapped, her father sends her brothers out to look for her. And of course, Cadmus is among her brothers. However, Cadmus visits the oracle at Delphi to try to get information about where Europa could be. And while he's there, the oracle tells him to break off from the group and to establish his own city. He's blessed by fortune, but his children are not so lucky. Cadmus has 4 daughters, all of whom experience tragedy. One of his daughters is Semele, the one who dies when she's pregnant with Dionysus after seeing Zeus in his full glory. Another one of his daughters is Ino. You may recall Ino as being that wicked stepmother of Phrixus who wanted to sacrifice him when we read about the Golden Fleece. She actually dies by her own hand, and this is after her husband has killed her son. So tragedy there too. Agave is driven mad by Dionysus and kills her own son, Pentheus, when she's in that frenzied state. You may recall that story too. And then we have Altene's son, who is another one of Cadmus's daughters. Her son is Actaeon, the one who was turned into a deer and pursued by Artemis, and his dogs ripped him up. So we see again this generational curse, although it's never really clear what Cadmus has done. Seemingly nothing, right? So again, we see a difference there, and kind of see how fate certainly doesn't always deliver bad to bad. Sometimes bad is delivered to good as well. But this family, this royal house of Thebes, their greatest misfortune descends upon the great great grandson of Cadmus. And that great great grandson is Oedipus. You probably know the story of Oedipus, right? I hope you know it, if you didn't know it before class already, from reading your book, by the way. So anyway, once Oedipus is born, his father, King Laius, gets a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi. Again, that's the oracle of Apollo. And the prophecy is that a son of his will one day kill him and marry his wife. Therefore, of course, that would mean Oedipus, right, is going to kill his father, and Oedipus would then marry his mother. So Laius, fearing this prophecy, chooses to send Oedipus away. He ties him up and has him carried away to the mountains, so he will be left to the elements, right, and die. However, a shepherd sees him and feels sorry for him and takes him and then gives him to someone to give to a king in another city. Now, when Oedipus is in this other place, right, living with these adoptive parents, Oedipus is told that one day he's going to kill his father. So he tries to avoid this by setting out to leave his home. He doesn't know that it's an adoptive family. And as we see, this idea of fate is inescapable, right? His father has tried to avoid the fate. Oedipus himself is trying to avoid this fate that the prophecy has revealed for him. And in doing so, instead of preventing it, they're both walking literally right into making this come true. So they meet one another on the road, and King Laius refuses to give ground to Oedipus. So Oedipus kills King Laius and all of the other men except for one. Now, when Laius has been killed, Thebes is beset with this terrible monster, the Sphinx. And this monster, of course, devours, excuse me, everyone who cannot answer her riddle. And no one has been able to answer it. So Oedipus approaches this Sphinx, and the Sphinx asks him, what creature goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? Well, Oedipus answers man, and that is the correct answer, because man crawls as a baby, right, on all fours, walks with 2 legs as an adult, and then needs a cane or a staff when they are elderly, therefore the 3 feet. The Sphinx is outraged and for some reason chooses to take her own life. So as a reward for freeing the city of Thebes, Oedipus becomes king and marries the widowed queen Jocasta, who is his mother. Neither one of them know this, of course. After they have children, a terrible plague comes upon Thebes, and Oedipus finds out from a prophet that he must indeed find out who murdered King Laius, and then the plague will be ended. So he consults Tiresias, the seer, for help. Tiresias uses his powers to see what's happened, to be able to find out who the murderer is. But of course, when he finds out who it is, he does not want to tell Oedipus, because Oedipus himself is the murderer. Oedipus forces him to answer, and when he does, he tells Oedipus, of course, that you are the murderer of the king. Oedipus and Jocasta, through a little period of time, begin to piece together the events. On the road from Delphi, right, when Oedipus kills a man in a heated argument, they realize that is King Laius, his father. Then they get a messenger from Polybus who comes in, and Oedipus learns from that he is not the true son of Polybus, right? That was an adoptive father. Of course, then he realizes that he is Laius's son, and he has fulfilled this horrible prophecy. Well, he's horrified. Of course, his mother is horrified because now she's his wife. They've had children together. So Jocasta ends up taking her own life, and Oedipus does not take his own life, but he does instead gouge out his eyes so that he can be in darkness. So he gives up his throne, but he is allowed to remain in Thebes. The throne passes to Creon, who is Jocasta's brother. Suddenly, Oedipus is exiled, and only his daughter Antigone goes with him in order to guide him, right? Because he is blinded now. So we finally rest in a place called Colonus. It is near Athens and it is sacred to the Eumenides. Remember, the Eumenides are the Furies once they're renamed, and they provide respite for the suppliant. So in the end, Theseus, that we know about, of course, from the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Theseus is the king of Athens, and he honors Oedipus for his unwitting suffering. And then Oedipus is able to die in peace. Now, Oedipus's other daughter, Antigone, remember, went with him, but his other daughter, Ismene, has remained in Thebes, and his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, fight over the throne. Eteocles eventually wins the throne, but Polynices then assembles an army to attack the city so he can take over the throne. He convinces 6 other chieftains to join him, and the 7 of them, the 7 against Thebes here, they go and they attack. Tiresias tells Creon that Thebes will only be saved if his son Menoetius dies. Creon tries to protect the boy from battle. However, Menoetius goes in, being that impetuous youth, right, goes on in and insists on battling, believing that he must make the sacrifice if necessary. And of course, when he does rush out into battle, he dies. But then Thebes is ultimately victorious. However, the 2 brothers, the sons of Oedipus, Eteocles and Polynices, end up killing each other in the battle. Polynices' dying words express his wish to be buried in his home city of Thebes, even though he has just battled against it. But Creon, who is on the throne, decrees instead that anyone who buries any of these 6 dead enemy leaders, including Polynices, will be put to death. Now, there's one survivor, right? Because recall, we said 7 against Thebes. So there's one that did survive, but Polynices and the others have died. So Antigone, who again is that daughter who went with Oedipus, she's back in Thebes now, and she's completely horrified by this decree that she will not be able to bury her brother. And that is because you may recall in Greek beliefs, if you do not give a proper burial to the dead, then they will be doomed to wander the earth. They cannot get passage into the underworld unless they have burial and an honorable death. And so what Antigone does is to go against the king in order to bury her brother. And also, she is not only choosing simply to bury her brother, but she's choosing the law of the gods over the law of a man, the king. So that's something that's important in this story too. So Creon, however, because she did go against him, he does indeed execute Antigone for burying her brother. Adrastus is the one survivor that I mentioned, and he petitions Theseus for help because he wants to see his other comrades also given a proper burial. So Theseus goes and tries to work out a negotiation with Creon. However, Creon still refuses to bury the dead or allow anyone else to bury these dead. So just a minute. It's so much, right? I gotta think a minute. So Theseus goes against Thebes in battle, and then he defeats them, and they are forced to give honorable burials to the other chieftains. But these sons of these dead men, even though they're given proper burials, they eventually band together because it wasn't enough for these sons of these men. They wanted to seek more vengeance. So they grouped together in a group known as the Epigony, or the Afterborn, and they just completely level Thebes. In the end, all that's left of Thebes is a necklace that Hephaestus gave to Harmonia, who is the wife of Cadmus, and he gave it to her upon their wedding. So we see Theseus remaining honorable too, defending those who are unable to defend themselves. So this is what we mentioned last week, of course, when we focused more on this family tree for Atreus. And now we're going to get more into this story that we previewed last week, right? And we dive deeper into today. I mentioned this idea, right, of a person most often meeting his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it, which is what we see play out in the story of Oedipus, right? He tries to avoid killing his father by leaving home. Unbeknownst to him, that was his adoptive father. And his father, his birth father, King Laius, sent Oedipus away into the mountains, right? Thinking that he was going to die out there. But instead, what they actually did was bring about this very tragic prophecy that they were trying to avoid. An example of this, too, is seen in Macbeth. When Macbeth encounters the three witches, they tell him that he is going to be king, and he begins a path of destruction, right? That leads not only to his being king, but also to his being killed. So the question really kind of remains in Macbeth too, in a little bit of a different way. Did Macbeth have no choice but to meet this fate? Or did these three witches plant something in his mind that then he made happen? Or could they read into Macbeth what he was already planning to do? So that's a good connection there, and question to think about. Just as a kind of funny aside, the Final Destination movies, right? They have this idea of fate, right? You can't cheat death, where someone, of course, gets a vision of how a tragedy is going to occur and people are going to die. So they stop that from happening. However, as it turns out, the people who were going to die in this tragic accident end up dying in other ways too. So that's more this idea of this inescapable fate, right? If it's fated or destined for you, you can't get out of it. And again, like I mentioned, we see this in Kung Fu Panda too. So we also notice some archetypal motifs. So archetypes can be events, characters, plots, something that we see is a recurring motif or recurring things that happen in different aspects of literature. So the first archetypal motif that we see in these stories is how one's punishment can be traced back to the sins of their ancestors. So we certainly saw this with the house of Atreus, right, where everything started with Tantalus. Other examples of this would be Sleeping Beauty, right? Her parents don't invite one of the fairies to her christening, and because of this, she is punished by pricking her finger on the spinning wheel, right? So she's paying for what her parents did or didn't do. Beauty and the Beast, we see that Belle's father, according to the Disney, right, Belle, but her father visits the castle, and because he breaks in somewhere and trespasses, she has to end up paying the price, right? Then we have Fenrir, an example from Norse mythology. He's the son of Loki and a giantess, and he's a wolf, but he's already seen, particularly by Odin, as being evil and terrible, even when he hasn't done anything. So this sin of Loki, right? All the things that Loki has done fall on Fenrir, right? And cause Fenrir not to be trusted. So we also see another motif, which is a quest and the king as a sacrificial scapegoat. So Oedipus is definitely this sacrificial scapegoat, right? He ends up dying eventually, right? But he takes his own eyes, he sacrifices his eyes in order to try to appease some of his guilt. We have Gandalf, right, who makes a sacrifice to save others during the Lord of the Rings trilogy. We have Aslan, if you're familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who chooses to allow the White Witch to take his life in the place of the traitor Edmund. Then we have Obi-Wan Kenobi, right, from Star Wars, A New Hope, who stands there pretty much and allows Darth Vader to defeat him so that then he can, through the Force, be a more powerful ally for Luke Skywalker. So this is something that you'll see in other stories. And now that we've talked about these two motifs, you may recognize this in other stories that you're familiar with. If so, feel free to drop that on the classroom page and let us know, and we'll have a discussion about some of these. So the next story we have focuses on the royal house of Athens. And this kind of gives us a contrast too, if you'll notice, from some of these stories, different aspects brought up, different values according to whether it was written by a Greek or a Roman writer, and kind of showing us their view of deities. So the sources that we get for these stories for Protny and Philomela, Edith Hamilton takes excerpts from Ovid, Apollodorus, and briefly from Thucydides, Pausanias, and Demosthenes. Procrus and Aretha comes from Ovid and Apollodorus, and Creusa and Ion comes from Euripides. The thing that is noted, especially for this royal house of Athens, is how many and how severe their supernatural occurrences were that happened to them. So we'll go ahead and talk about that. So Seacrops was the first king of Attica. There are different variations according to his origin. There is a poem that we have an excerpt from here that shows that he is no human, he has no human ancestors, so he's only half man. Seacrops, lord and hero, born of a dragon, dragon-shaped below. So of course, meaning that his upper half would look like a man, but then his bottom half would be dragon-like. But here you'll notice in our little note at the bottom, some sources record Seacrops as being fully human and being especially notable for being the great grandfather of Theseus. So we do see these variations in the myths from time to time. So Seacrops is believed to be responsible for Athena's coming to rule Athens. So Athena and Poseidon both want to rule the city, and a vote is taken, and there are more women than men in the city. And because of this reason, at least according to mythology, right, Athena is chosen instead. And then Poseidon is angry, so he punishes the city with a flood. And then the men are angry because not only did Poseidon not win, instead a goddess, Athena, did, but now the city's flooded. So they blame everything on the women, and this is when they take away women's right to vote, at least according to this myth, right? So we see it has a connection to women's suffrage. But again, we see this theme, right, where we have things being blamed on the women. So this story of Protny and Philomela, this is a story of two sisters and an arranged marriage. So Tereus, the son of Ares, and as the old saying goes, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, right? Tereus has many of the same traits as his father Ares. Recall that Ares is bloodthirsty Ares is the brutal side of warfare, and no one really likes Ares. Remember, not even his parents, Zeus and Hera. So these traits follow him into Tereus. And so Tereus is married to, let me make sure, let me double check. Although I've read this story and done it so many times, believe it or not, sometimes you can get a little mixed up between which sister is which. So I want to make sure that I double check. Yes, okay, so Protny is married to Tereus. It is Protny. And she wants her sister to come for a visit. So Tereus says, I'll go and get Philomela and bring her back for a visit. However, when Tereus sees Philomela, he is overcome by her beauty. So he decides that he wants Philomela. And he tells Philomela that Protny, her sister, has died. And now Philomela is to marry him. However, Philomela learns the truth and finds out that Protny is very much alive and that Tereus has lied to her. So to make sure that Protny cannot tell, or excuse me, make sure that Philomela cannot tell Protny what happened, Tereus cuts out Philomela's tongue and then imprisons her to make sure that she cannot tell anyone what he's done. And then he goes back and tells Protny that Philomela has died. However, Philomela weaves this beautiful tapestry that tells the story of what happened to her, what Tereus did to her. And then it's given as a gift to her sister. So this is considered coding, this tapestry of truth. Coding, that would be covert or hidden expressions of subversive or disturbing ideas, right? It is a way for Philomela to be able to tell Protny the truth without coming right out and saying it, which she literally can't, right? But it offers that hidden message for her. And if you are interested in finding out more about this, I put a note down here too of a book, Feminist Messages, Coding in Women's Folk Culture, which is edited by Joan Newland Radner. So if you're interested in this idea of coding and how these subversive ideas can be coded or hidden in forms of literature or tapestries, right? Then check that book out. So after this, what happens is another twisted kind of tale. Of course, we see so many of these. Protny rescues her sister, and for revenge, she kills the son that she has with Tereus, Oedipus. Now, in our text, it says that the more she looks at Oedipus, the more she sees is Tereus. So she feels that her son is going to end up being just like Tereus. However, that's not an excuse for what she does. She cooks him and serves him to his father, Tereus. Once Tereus realizes what happened, the women are running away from him. He pursues them. As he's about to catch them, the gods end up taking pity on the women and they turn them into birds. So Protny becomes the beautiful singing nightingale, and Philomela, the one, of course, without the tongue, is turned into a songless swallow. Again, like I said, this idea recurring, although Edith Hamilton brought out, the Greeks didn't like human sacrifice. Maybe they didn't like it, but it's sure in a lot of the myths, right? Now we have the story of Procris and Cephalus. They had a happy marriage until Aurora, the dawn, fell in love with Cephalus. And so she decides to whisk him away. However, When she does whisk him away, he refuses to have anything to do with her, even though she is Aurora, right? He says, no, I'm absolutely in love with Procris, and I don't want to, I don't want to be with you. So she sends him back. However, she plants this suspicious idea in his mind and says, well, you're being faithful to Procris, but are you really sure that she's been faithful to you all this time you've been gone? So he decides to disguise himself and go back to Procris and try to woo her, as he's disguised as a stranger, right? He's trying to test her faithfulness. He repeatedly tries to seduce her, but she always stays faithful. One day, she briefly, and it mentions, of course, briefly, she briefly hesitates before she rejects the advances of this stranger. When this happens, he becomes very angry and he reveals who he is. And Procris, rightfully angry, runs away from him. However, Cephalus realizes his anger and he goes and they reunite. And unfortunately, tragedy strikes again, as while hunting, Cephalus accidentally kills Procris with his javelin because she's out where he is, suspicious that he's wooing one of the nymphs. So this story really shows, how damaging this suspicion can be in a relationship, and neither one of them were even right about their suspicions. So a tragic ending to this story. Then we have a brief mention of Aretha and Boreas, the north winds. He is interested in Aretha. She doesn't want anything to do with him, and her father doesn't. However, Boreas carries her off anyway. So Socrates says, this really didn't happen. So these stories are just stories. And that's a paraphrase, of course. So we start to see kind of that shift, right? Where this belief in the gods and goddesses is kind of beginning to fade. Then we have the story of Creusa and Ion, which also shows us that Apollo, even though he was considered to be this bright, wonderful god of justice, he also does some horrible things too. So Creusa is kidnapped and attacked, we'll leave it at that, by Apollo. And after this, she ends up getting pregnant, and she feels a heavy guilt because of it. And she gives birth, but she leaves her son in the cave where Apollo assaulted her. However, she later feels guilty again about leaving her son. So she goes back in order to get him. However, at that point, he's vanished. And meanwhile, she's been married to a man named Xuthus. And Xuthus and Creusa are unable to conceive a child. So they visit the oracle at Delphi. Again, this is the oracle of Apollo. They visit there for advice to find out if they're going to be able to have a child. While Xuthus is conferring with one of the priests there at the oracle, Creusa speaks to this very beautiful young priest by the name of Ion. She asks him, without Xuthus hearing, what happened to the baby that she abandoned so long ago in the cave. Once she's asked this question, Xuthus suddenly appears and hugs Ion, saying that Apollo told him that Ion was going to be their son. Then there's an older priestess there who is able to reveal that she found Ion when he was a baby, and that he was wrapped in a cloak and veil. And at this moment, Creusa realizes that Ion, this young priest standing before her, is indeed the son that she abandoned. Athena then makes an appearance and confirms the truth of this revelation and announces that one day Ion will become a great king of Athens. So things do end up well for Creusa and Ion after all. So be sure to check the classroom page for your poem and answer the questions, and have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching. Bye.